Tonight, a defiant Independence Day. Ukraine marks the country's independence from the Soviet Union in the midst of war, 6 months since the Russian invasion. Plus, the results are in after last night's primaries. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation.
Tonight, Ukraine marks a bittersweet Independence Day, but we begin our program with a major new development from the White House, slashing student loans. Good evening and welcome to Faith Nation. In Washington, I'm Caitlin Burke. $300 billion. That's how much the White House is announcing in student loan debt relief. President Biden set to slash up to $20,000 in student loans per eligible borrower. The cancellation of that debt in addition to more across-the-board pauses to repayments on other student loans. Our CBN News Capitol Hill correspondent Matt Galka joins us now with how that could affect you. Matt?
Well, Caitlin, the president said he was keeping a campaign promise when he announced the cancellation of up to $10,000 of federal student loan debt for most borrowers. The White House says around 20 million people could get their debt completely wiped out with the move.
It focuses the benefit on middle class and working families. It helps both current and future borrowers and will fix a badly broken system. And these actions build on my administration's effort to make college more affordable in the first place.
The debt relief extends beyond the $10,000 if students borrowed federal Pell Grants. Pell Grants are typically awarded to low-income families. The White House says that Pell Grant borrowers can get up to $20,000 canceled.
Those Pell Grants used to cover 80% of the cost of going to a public four-year college. Today, Pell Grants cover roughly 32%. That's 1/3 of the cost as opposed to before. It matters.
The debt forgiveness is available for people earning under $125,000 per year or households under $250,000 a year. More progressive lawmakers had called for debt cancellation of up to $50,000. The president also said there would be one final pause of federal loan repayments until the end of the year. Caitlin?
Thanks, Matt. Let's bring in Lindsay Burke, Director of Center for Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Lindsay, thanks for joining us tonight on Faith Nation. First off, to average Americans faced with crushing student loan debt, what does this loan forgiveness mean?
Well, today the Biden administration has put into motion a plan that will further inflate college costs, hinder economic growth, reward upper income earners, and really provide a major handout to left-leaning institutions of higher education. And I think it's important to remember that for most borrowers today, their student loan debt repayments are manageable. The median monthly student loan payment is $222 a month. So this idea that most borrowers have this crushing student loan debt isn't borne out by the facts. And if their debt is not manageable, there are already programs in place to help them manage it. But what the Biden administration did today was really throw fuel on this inflationary fire that will drive up the cost of tuition in the long run and really hand the tab to working class Americans who either did not or could not attend college.
What do you make of the continuation of the current moratorium on student loan debt?
Well, this is probably the most regressive component of the plan. This moratorium on having to repay your student loan every month costs $5 billion per month. $5 billion per month. And the benefit of that pause is that interest does not accrue on your loans. And that means that for individuals who are upper income earners, individuals who maybe went to law school or medical school, that they are the primary beneficiaries of this pause on repayments. There was an estimate put out by the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget that found that medical doctors who went to medical school, on average, are receiving about $48,500 in benefits, not having to pay that accrued interest. And attorneys have received already about $29,500 on average as a result of this pause on repayment. The Biden administration says they're going to continue that pause through December 31st, so this will be the final extension. But I will be very curious to see if it is indeed the final extension or if we will see this moratorium continue once more.
With all of that said, the issue of student debt is real and costs are going up, as you said. Is there a solution to the college debt crisis?
Well, costs are going up. They have been going up for decades, but it's largely a function of federal subsidies. We know that total federal aid over the past 30 years has increased 295%. That's federal student loans and grants. And what have universities done in response? They have more than doubled their tuition and fees in order to capture those subsidies. And we know that's what they do. There was a report that came out from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York a few years ago that found that for every additional dollar in subsidized student loans, universities increased tuition 63 cents. So they are capturing those additional subsidies. But really, at the end of the day, why would anyone ever pay their loans again? People are currently getting an interest-free loan because of this pause on repayments. Massive chunks of their loan balances are being transferred to somebody else. So this policy is creating a huge moral hazard, not to mention the fact that it really insults the millions of responsible borrowers who worked their way through college to avoid debt or worked hard to pay off their college debt after graduation.
Lindsay, anything else on this that you feel like is important to point out?
Well, I think in the long term, student loan debt cancellation, and really it's a misnomer. This is simply shifting debt onto somebody else. It's a transfer of debt to all American taxpayers, the majority of whom did not attend college. But this debt transfer will encourage universities to raise tuition in the future. And remember, even though this cohort of borrowers are having a chunk of their debt, quote, forgiven, people are still borrowing right now, today. New loans are being taken out to pay for college in the fall. And so, of course, moving forward, the expectation will be on the part of the consumer that their loans will also be forgiven in the future. And so that's likely to create a lot of bad incentives, people attending more expensive universities than they might otherwise have done, people taking longer to go through college, people taking out the maximum amount of student loan they can in anticipation that it will also be forgiven in the future.
All right, Lindsay Burke with the Heritage Foundation, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you.
The results of last night's closely watched primary elections are sending ripples across the country. In Florida, Charlie Crist easily won the Democratic primary race. Crist was the governor of Florida from 2007 to 2011. He was a Republican then, but has since become a Democrat. He will be challenging the Republican incumbent, Ron DeSantis, who's leading Crist in the polls. And in New York, Congressman Jerry Nadler easily defeated a fellow member of the House, Carolyn Maloney. The two Democrats ran against each other after a court forced the two veteran lawmakers into the same district in New York City. Coming up, a bittersweet celebration. Why the resolve of Ukrainians is stronger than ever on this Independence Day, 6 months into war. A Russian rocket attack in Ukraine killing at least 15 people and wounding some 50 more. The deadly barrage falling on the 6-month mark of Russia's invasion. This latest grim milestone comes as Ukraine celebrates its independence from the Soviet Union. And as bloody battles push on throughout the region, the U.S. is pledging to send another $3 billion to help the fight. CBN's Brody Carter joins us now with that report. Brody?
Caitlin, fear overshadowed celebrations of freedom in Ukraine today. The country's president warned the Russians would attempt something particularly cruel on this day. Ukraine gained its independence in 1991 with the Soviet Union's collapse. Wednesday's somber holiday also coincides with 6 months of war. Ukraine police increased patrols, including strict enforcement of the nighttime curfew. News reports indicate the U.S. shared intelligence with Ukraine about the heightened risk of Russian strikes on civilians in town centers. President Volodymyr Zelensky commemorated the holiday with prayer in Kyiv. Public celebrations are banned. Prayers for peace also came from the Vatican as attendees held Ukrainian flags while Pope Francis denounced the war and loss of life on both sides. Several air raid sirens sounded throughout the day, a reminder of the danger that's become part of everyday life. In another show of support, President Biden announced the largest single monetary aid package so far to Ukraine, $3 billion of weapons and equipment. In a statement, the president said in part, "Today and every day, we stand with the Ukrainian people to proclaim that the darkness that drives autocracy is no match for the flame of liberty that lights the souls of free people everywhere." As the war drudges on, missile strikes overnight targeted Kharkiv. Ukraine also accuses Russia of renewed shelling at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, intentionally putting radioactive dust into the air. The risk of nuclear disaster led several countries asking for peace at another emergency United Nations meeting.
Why on earth is a nuclear facility being used as a staging ground for war by Russian forces?
The UN estimates roughly 5,500 civilians have been killed since the war began on February 24th. More than 6 million refugees have left the country. Brody Carter, CBN News.
Thanks, Brody. Joining us now is CBN News senior international correspondent George Thomas. George, you've spent time in Ukraine and you know these people well. How bittersweet is it for Ukrainians to be celebrating Independence Day while still at war with Russia?
Yeah, I've been talking to friends and contacts in Kyiv, in Mariupol, and folks that are in areas that are besieged by the Russians. And they say, look, listen, the fact that 31 years later, after gaining their independence from the Soviet Union, they are still fighting for freedom again. But I think what is different this time around, and what is different between the Ukrainians and the Russians, Caitlin, is the fact that Ukraine, unlike Russia, is very united like never before. And this is what motivates people. You go on social media, on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter, and Ukrainians are posting. Yesterday was the celebration of the national flag, the blue and the yellow. You get the sense of nationality, and also the reality is that they're fighting for freedom again. And so the difference here is that the Ukrainians are united like never before. The Russians, on the other hand, are wondering what on earth is going on.
What about the church in Ukraine? How's it holding up 6 months into this invasion?
I was talking to a pastor just in the last few days who serves in Ukraine, in Kyiv, the capital city. He's been there since February 24th. I met him when the bombs were falling on the capital city, and he's still there. And the reality, Caitlin, is that it's not just in Kyiv, from Zaporizhzhia to Lviv to Mariupol to Kharkiv to Kramatorsk, all these places where the church has had a powerful influence over the last 31 years, they're still there. Mind you, the church is run by men. Why? Because most of the women, most of the children have fled, and so it's up to the men, to the pastors of the church, to continue shepherding the flock. And the reality is that they continue to minister, to bring humanitarian aid to the conflict areas, to the front lines. It's absolutely incredible, the sense of bravery that you see, the incredible display of bravery. These men who go into the enemy's camp, who go right into the front line to rescue people or to bring humanitarian aid. The church continues, as is the case in all other conflicts, be it the ones that I've covered in Syria, Afghanistan, Nigeria. It is always the church that is at the forefront of helping in the time of need.
What do you think the next 6 months looks like for Ukraine?
I think, the administration's decision to send billions of dollars more on this anniversary, this grim anniversary, is just another indication that the administration, that the United States is in this for the long haul. Look, the amount of money we've given the Ukrainians in the last 6 months has really allowed the Ukrainians to fend off a complete takeover of the country. Remember, the prognostication was that within 3 days, Kyiv would be surrounded. The Zelensky government would be decapitated. Here we are 6 months later. Look, the Russians have made some advancements in the east, but I think the next 6 months you're going to see a continued slog. It's going to be rough. It's going to be deadly. Both sides are going to lose men and women, soldiers as well. But I don't see necessarily a major counteroffensive against the Russians. Basically, you're going to see a standstill. The Ukrainians will hold the line. The Russians are trying to move. You're going to have this back and forth. But eventually, I've made the prediction. I did this several times over the last 6 months. I'm going to predict that the Ukrainians are not only going to retake the eastern part of Ukraine, but they're also going to retake Crimea. And we've seen in the last 3-4 days the incredible attacks, the very bold attacks against this very strategic peninsula on the Black Sea. And I think as you see more money, more equipment, missiles, long-range missiles being poured into Ukraine, it's going to take the battle to the Russians. And unfortunately, this is not going to end anytime soon.
George Thomas, thank you so much for coming on.
You're welcome.
When we come back, the latest on the Iran nuclear deal and why an agreement could be closer than ever. Iran is making some major concessions in efforts to restore some kind of a nuclear deal with the U.S. and European Union. That, according to exclusive reporting from Reuters, citing a U.S. official. Tehran is said to be dropping its demands that a nuclear watchdog end its investigation into Iran's atomic program. The U.S. now set to respond to a draft EU agreement that would bring back the 2015 nuclear deal abandoned by former President Trump. 1 year after the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, the state of religious freedom in the country is bleak. In a hearing today, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom described what life is like for minorities in Afghanistan since the Taliban took over, concluding that for many, the only chance of safety and freedom is to leave.
Policymakers across the U.S. government in every nook and every silo of our sprawling democracy must realize that this, for many Afghans, the only option for survival, the only option for freedom, the only option to be able to build meaningful lives is to leave. And leaving requires assistance, especially from members of minority religions, ethnic minorities, and other groups who cannot survive, let alone thrive in Afghanistan.
Joseph Azam went on to say there's a long history of practicing Christians and Jews in Afghanistan, but unfortunately both groups now practice their faith in hiding. Joining us now is USERF Commissioner David Curry. David, thanks for joining us tonight on Faith Nation. Is religious freedom in Afghanistan non-existent at this point?
Well, it's certainly embattled. People are practicing their faith, but as you said, they're doing it in secret. They're doing it in hiding. And that's because ever since the withdrawal of the American troops on August 15th of last year, there's been a tightening down of restrictions by the Taliban. They promised there'd be a new and improved Taliban. It's been just the opposite. It's the same old thing. They're trying to impose Sharia law on Afghan religious minorities, Christians, Jews, and others. And it means basically they started tracking them down, going house to house with lists. And now that's put many of these religious minorities on the run. And they're not only just battling the Taliban, but there's ISIS and its version there, ISIS-K is what it's called. So they're often caught in the crossfire, two different groups trying to track them down.
Can you give us an idea of how many Christians and other religious minority groups are actually there in hiding under Taliban rule?
Well, there are obviously very many religious minorities who escaped, millions that tried to escape when the administration pulled out and the Taliban took over. We don't identify exactly the numbers of Christians, for example, within the region, for fear that the Taliban and ISIS will then put together another checklist and try to find them. But we know that there are thousands and thousands of Christians there. We know that there are members of the Baha'i faith and Jews that are there. And not to mention also the non-Sunni Muslims in the country who are also being targeted. So there's a number of really difficult combinations there in Afghanistan a year later.
What are the consequences for Christians and other religious minorities if they are found by the Taliban?
Well, they certainly can lose their life. There's been many killings and targeting of religious minority groups, some bombings. The gruesome facts, really, that we released in our report yesterday paint a picture of the kind of inhumanity that the Taliban has brought to their country in the last year. Surprisingly, when we released this report yesterday, they shot back and said, no, that there is freedom of religious expression in Afghanistan. So it's a bizarro world there, and we need to stand up and let our voice be heard as a government, United States of America, be a strong voice on this and bring allies, preferably from around the world, Muslim countries as well, if possible, to say that this should not be, this is the most inhumane condition for religious minorities, for Christians and others.
Beyond speaking out, what can the U.S. be doing policy-wise to help support vulnerable Afghans?
Well, one thing we can do, there are, for example, 1,600 Christians and other religious minorities stuck in Abu Dhabi a year later. The government can fast track some of the, well, it's not even fast tracking at this point. They can begin to focus again on some of these Christians that are stuck in a no man's land. They haven't gotten the status from the customs and border agencies they need. And there doesn't seem to be any timeline for how to deal with these Christians who, if shipped back to Afghanistan, will most certainly be killed. It's not just Christians. There are also other religious minorities in the group. But that's just one case. We got to find a way to try to assimilate some of these people whose very lives are on the line if they're shipped back to Afghanistan, and spread it out across the countries and partners and allies that can assimilate them in a healthy way.
We've got about 30 seconds left. Are things worse off now for vulnerable Afghans than they were this time last year? Without question. The Taliban is tightening their control. People have gotten the message. They've reinstituted their secret police, if you will. There's a name for it that escapes me right now, but basically trying to make sure that their people are sticking with the propaganda of the Taliban, and they're using this to continue to look for people who are going to dissent from their Sharia law extreme medieval views. USERF Commissioner David Curry, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you.
Coming up, from coursework to the obstacle course, how this Liberty grad earned the title Country Boy Ninja next. Finally tonight, from the farm to the dojo, a Liberty University graduate is climbing his way to the American Ninja Warrior Finals. He's known as Country Ninja Boy, doing his training for the competition show on a farm. But Josiah Singleton is also pursuing his master's in biblical studies while serving as the student discipleship director at a church. Josiah advanced to the finals for the first time this year.
Into the net. And he's done it. Josiah safety pass for stage 2 off Josiah.
Singleton completed the qualifying run of his rookie season in Atlanta. Now the talented Virginia native is battling it out with 69 other ninjas for a whopping prize of $100,000. That's going to do it for Faith Nation tonight. We'll see you tomorrow.